All right, I think that we can get started. Hey, welcome to this first live event. We've had quite a few people asking how to put together entities. And all of this starts with the entity scoping exercise. And what we're going to try to do today is to hear from those people who have actually done it. They're going to share with us how they approach entity scoping. And I'm going to pass the floor to Eric Martret, who is one of the very active members of the GRC community and who's got quite a bit of experience in this field. So Eric, if you could maybe in 5 minutes share your experience over how you approach entity scoping, why you do it the way you do it, and some of the do's and don'ts over your methods.
The first thing I want to say is all the process of scoping to create entities is based on data. The very first pitfall I've seen with a lot of customers is to try to work with low quality data. And that's true when you try to build entities from a CMDB, for instance. If the CMDB is not reliable, you will have wrong data. If your organization layer is not correctly designed into ServiceNow with your companies, divisions, business units, departments, etc., if it's not correct, it's not maintained, you will as well have difficulties to get the correct entities. So I'm working at the moment with 3 customers, and 2 of them are banks. We talk about operational risk with the risk event and the advanced risk assessment module, for instance. For this, we talk about the organization because it's business unit and department level that everything happens. And clearly, the data is not maintained correctly, and they have various sources of truth in the company. And it's very, very hard for them to decide internally what is the actual source of truth, how we should feed the information into ServiceNow to make sure that we have at any time the right connections between companies. They have 25 companies, other business units which are attached behind that, and then the department, etc. It is critical because we will target these tables to create the related entities on which we will attach risk events, risks, controls, etc.
Does this mean that every department, every business unit, every business is an entity?
Not all of them. Of course, we target specific entities that will have here risk events, that will have for operational risk. You need to have the right taxonomy, and you need to have reliable data to be able to target these tables. And that shows hard to achieve, particularly for large companies, because they don't have a single source of truth. And up until now, when it was purely into IT, with the IT department, basically they were maintaining the organization themselves into ServiceNow, and it was fit for purpose for their own need, for ITSM, for ITBM, etc. But now that we talk about a whole organization, about 200,000 people worldwide with about 50 countries, etc., it is a gigantic effort. And there's no single source of truth. There's no single area where we can say this is how it should be represented, because you have an organizational standpoint, you have the legal standpoint with legal entities, you have the audit, which have its own view of the organization structure. It's tricky. It creates difficulties to actually implement and run your scoping exercise properly. It's the same thing on IT as well, actually. Maybe not on the organizational aspect, but on the technical entities, on the CMDB ones as well. If your CMDB is not reliable, you will tend to take data and create entities, generate entities on something which is not reliable, and that's a big issue. The second thing I wanted to say is about the level of depth, because that's a critical one, obviously, and particularly when we talk about technology. CMDB can be very, very rich, can have a lot of different layers, from business service to applications to different layers of servers to storage kits to a database and lower, etc., back to the information assets at the bottom of the chain. If you're not careful, you intend to create hundreds of controls for each of the thousands and thousands or millions of CIs there. And of course, it's unmanageable. So one of the key rule of thumb that I have found on this business is you need to make sure that if you go for controlling for risks which need to have an assessment or an attestation or somebody responding to something, you need to ensure that you have someone behind each of those CIs. And if there's nobody there, it's clearly you are too deep in hierarchy of the CMDB. You need to go a level higher. For instance, another bank, actually, they had something like 20,000 servers, and they have applied about 100 controls to 20,000 servers. You can imagine the number of actual controls that represent. It's unmanageable. And of course, there's no controller for each individual server. And we have convinced them to go at a level higher, to say, actually, you don't want to target 20,000 servers. You want to tackle 5 builds one for Windows, one for Linux, one for AX, one for etc., Solaris, etc., because it is where you will have your controls. Every of your servers are the same. They are built exactly the same way. So you want to have your controls at the level of the build, and then 100 times multiplied by 5, not by 20,000. You can create controls at the lower level of the hierarchy if they are automated. Yes, if it's based on indicators, absolutely fine, that can work, but not controls or risks that require specific attestations or assessments.
Okay, so really for you, it's data and depth, right? Making sure that you have as clean data as possible and managing the depth to avoid this incredible creep of work that then makes the whole system unmanageable.
I mean, entity management is the best and the worst thing together.
Yeah.
You know, it's the best if you manage it correctly. If you go too far without control, and as well, of course, you have to go iteratively. Don't go for the big thing immediately. Go step by step. Create a first layer, and then if you are satisfied with that, go for the next level of depth and test it to see how it can work.
Thank you very much for this. Before we pass the floor to somebody else, could you give us the names of 5 entities and what entity type did they belong to?
I cannot name entities because entities would be very, very detailed, but entity types, yes. So entity types can be typically for organization, companies, business units, departments, etc. And for IT purposes, very often we'll have business services, applications, servers, different kind of servers, Windows, Linux, etc. These are the kind of entity types we find the most in the clients I've been able to work with. And then, of course, if you want to add other layers like vendors, like business processes, etc., it is as well quite common, but you need to have some data, of course, to play with that. So not a lot of customers yet have processes into ServiceNow.
Yeah.
That just starts to happen now.
Okay. I want to give the floor to Philip Swann.
In terms of entity scoping, it's one of the challenges I've found in the past is trying to find the correct attributes for the organization to zoom in on and drive really focused results to their risk and compliance landscape. So quite often customers are faced with an all or nothing decision when it comes to defining entity type filters due to that lack of data quality. One of the solutions I've used in the past and seems to be fairly robust is to leverage the GRC choice table, and this gives us a scoped list field, and we can add that to core tables. So something like the CMDB or location, etc. And this enables GRC to tag the records and then filter on them. And then from here, you can ramp up your GRC implementation. You can start small, start to get value from that, and then continue to scale that up. So GRC, we have the choice table, and we can put then a list field onto one of our, I've highlighted here some of the core reference tables that we would typically use that were mentioned. So CMDB, location, department, company, etc. And then you can filter using your entity type based on a choice. And then I can show this in practice very quickly. So in the GRC choice table, I create a new set in here called scope of applicability. The choice category I've given here CMDB, and then I've come up with, and this data can be maintained by the GRC admin. They have rights to this table. They can create new choices within CMDB and create a new, essentially a tag. And then, for instance, in the perimeter detection business service, this is a scoped form section down here where I can also give myself as an owner. If maybe the managed by, etc., is not the person that we want to own the controls or the entity, we can actually come in here and filter. Now, I've already got the full scope one in here because it's filtered based on CMDB. And then the entity type, just an example here for SNGRC choice, I've got a filter that says, I want my GRC SOA to contain this option. And then that's set up, we get we can see the two fields on here. If I look at the entity type, we've got our perimeter detection that's been picked up. And what that means is I can give the rights to the GRC team. They only have permission to update the GRC field. They can come in here and bring this into scope for 2021, go through their business services and tag them. And as they tag these records, obviously the beautiful automation within GRC enables the entities to be ramped up as and when they're ready. Okay, so we're not dependent on the quality of the CMDB itself, and it gives us some degree of ownership and maintenance responsibility within GRC. So something like crown jewels, etc., can be tagged in as and when that scope is defined. So that's just something I wanted to share that we have built and delivered in the past that I think it's fairly robust and enables the data quality issues to be overcome, at least in the short or interim, or even as a long-term solution, depending.
Very cool. Since we've got you here, could you tell us a little bit what is entity class and how do you use entity class?
Yeah, entity class actually is something we should always consider from the beginning and check if you're using a table that's not necessarily standard, or if it's an extension of the CMDB that's not already listed in the core application options that come out. Then make sure you've set up your entity class. Make sure you've set up your entity class rules as well from the beginning. That will just save you some effort. And then I'm sure Scott can probably give a bit more information on this, because we did have a chat recently on this topic. But things like advanced risk assessment is going to be very dependent on entity classes. It also helps to drive the risk hierarchy and things like the GRC Workbench. So if you set that up from the beginning, it gives a few things to begin with, I think, is around reporting. It makes it easy to access those entities in a meaningful way. And it also then starts to drive more value when you start to use things like advanced risk or risk workbench. And probably there's going to be more to come, I imagine. But it's starting to become really important now.
Yeah, but this is more like an optional feature, right? You don't really need when you get started.
It's optional, but I always like to set it up from the beginning, and you set and forget. The rules only are defined at the table level. So what you don't want to have is thousands of entities with no class in them, when if you set it up from the beginning, they could have a class, and it would just save you a bit of manual effort.
And how would you make the difference between an entity class and an entity type?
So, an entity class is actually talking about the entity itself, and it's giving it a bit of a handle, whereas an entity type is a grouping of entities. And obviously an entity can be in more than one entity type. For instance, it could be a business service, and equally it could be a critical business service. So you could have two entity types there, and that helps to drive your scoping of controls and risks, whereas an entity class, an entity can only have one entity class.
All right, thank you very much, Philip. I think next I'd like to hear from Rafaël. How do you approach entity type? Why do you make the choices you make? And what kind of advice can you give on the do's and don'ts?
In terms of entities, and when we do approach a customer, so the first thing that you should do is always start by the entities, define entity class, define the rules, define the type. It's very important because in the future, as soon as things get complex, you're going to skip that step. You're going to have, if you don't define it at the beginning, you're going to have entities without any kind of class. One of the struggles that we have on beginning is we need to understand exactly the roadmap of the client, where you are at the moment and where you want to be, what you are using. Try to understand and try to identify what is a class, what should become an entity, what should become an entity type, and making that approach understandable. And Eric was right. It can get simple if you know the logic behind of GRC, but it can be very complex. And you can literally turn GRC like very hard to manage if you don't set this at the beginning. It's very crucial to make it clear since the beginning. Even if you don't think that you have entities available, even if you think that, okay, I don't know what I should call entity type or what I should call entity class. I don't know what kind of entities I'm going to have in the future, but try to use the samples provided by ServiceNow, which is a perfect example to start. And from that moment on, you can start to add some complexity. It's very important just to have a baseline. That's my advice. I think Phil have covered and Eric have covered most of the topics.
Good. We got a couple of questions, and maybe I'm going to pass the floor to Scott.
Excellent.
Maybe you're going to help us wrap this up. Hi, Scott. Is entity specific to GRC and probably specific to ServiceNow, and why?
Yeah, so so to answer that question, and I want to address it a couple of different ways, right? So to talk about the entity type, entity class, entity construct within the ServiceNow ecosystem, that absolutely is a GRC specific concept. And there's a reason why. Phil and Rafaël, Eric, they've all touched on this a little bit. So let me just make it very clear. When you think about first setting up your entities, the one question I ask, what are the things that you want to manage? Regardless of your vertical industry or your geo or wherever it may be, there's things that you need to manage for some reason, whether it's a regulatory reason or it's just an internal control. And typically customers who start off, they probably have an Excel spreadsheet somewhere that says things like all of our banking offices need to have a security system, or all of our servers need to be hardened, right? They've got those types of statements made. That's really what you need to define those entities, because we need within the GRC space to automatically, generate risks, assign controls, and get them to the right owners. And we need to be able to do that. So the entity type is really this extraction layer. It's a meta layer to say, I need to be able to map controls to any variety of people, places, and things. Places could be all banking offices, or people being that everyone's gone through the anti-money laundering training, or all servers that are internet facing that need to be hardened. So in order for us to systematically be able to take controls and get them assigned to the right people, the entity type construct is this abstraction layer that then can be mapped to any underlying table within the ServiceNow ecosystem, so that I can map a server or a location or a person or a business service to a risk framework or a control objective, and take advantage of that automation and the creation of that. It is a GRC concept for ServiceNow, so that we have this systematic, automatic way of getting controls and risks assigned to the right entity owner, because that entity could be any people, person, place, thing from across the entire ecosystem. Does that help answer that question, Eric?
I think so. So let me read to you the follow-on statement. It's a brand new install, so they've not started entering information yet. For the entity data that was created when the GRC module was uploaded, was that data based on the program found in our database, in addition to some of the standard entities that ServiceNow provides?
Maybe you're a ServiceNow first customer in the GRC space and you don't have any of the other areas. To take advantage of that construct, it's very simple to, and I'll use the IT example, a list of all of my servers. Maybe you're not doing IT. If you get that list of servers in the system, right, and you do need to upload that information that you care about, it goes back to what are the things that I care about that I want to be able to manage. And if you have a list of those, then your gold copy, your authoritative source says these are the things, then the entity types can be pointed at that, so that then the automation, right? Because the system will automatically generate or retire entities based upon the authoritative record. And that happens systematically or automatically. So you could just take a list of whatever those things that you want to manage, get them in a table, point the entity type at that particular table, and then allow the system to manage the risk and controls the entities automatically from that point forward.
Very good. And let me switch over to something else. How many entity types do you normally see in the IT general computer control space?
If you don't mind, Eric, there's one other thing that I would like to go back to help to answer this question. Phil, he mentioned, and I think Eric did as well, the value of the profile filters. If you don't mind, I would like to share one slide here to talk about this concept. The reason I want to talk about this very quickly is because it's probably going to increase the number of entity types that you have. So when you think about the right number of entity types really needs to be, well, what are all of the different categories or collections of things that you need to manage? Right, and that is going to vary greatly from company to company. It's going to vary greatly even from vertical or industry to industry, right? But what are the things that you want to manage? So if you think about your business, I need to be able to assign controls or assess risk for things that contain financial data, or because there it's about protecting the data, or contains customer data because I need to do controls in place around privacy and protecting customer data, or I need to have things in place around is internet facing. So when you start to think about all of the people, places, and things that you need to manage, and how you would categorize them. Contains financial data, contains customer data, contains internet-facing data. Those definitions of how I would scope that will equate directly to an entity type. And the reason I show this kind of Venn diagram over here on the right-hand side, if I put this from a banking example, from a financial perspective, and I look at examples of business applications, right? Your online banking, loan origination, the payroll systems, marketing systems, many of these would fall into these different kind of categories. Online banking contains financial data, is internet facing, contains customer data, but something like your, thebanksite.com, right? Whatever your bank is.com, it probably doesn't have financial data and it doesn't have customer data because it's more of just this is who we are, these are the services we provide, this is what we have. So when you think of it in this terms, these different applications would show up in different areas. So I can actually have 3 entity types in my example here. I end up with 9 entities that actually, in some cases, that entity shows up in more than one entity type. So this number 2 would get all of the controls for contains customer data and is internet facing, but 5 only gets internet facing and 8 only gets customer data. So there's this notion of nesting entity types. So now to go back, right, now that I've kind of talked about this concept, how many entity types is the right number of entity types? Think about your business. What are those categories or groups of things that you want to be able to manage by category? And I'm just using the 3 examples here. How those then get categorized are how you write your entity types with those entity filters. You then end up getting all of the right entities in those right ones, and then you assign the control objectives or the risk statements based upon that filter so that you get the right controls assigned to the right entity, and it's all about nesting the entity types. So the number is a variable. It really depends on how you categorize, how you group, how you collect, and that's going to drive you to what the right number of entity types are.
All right, and it looks like the audience is appreciative of this graph you just showed, Scott. Let me press a little bit still. How many entity types do you think one should have in the IT general community? Is it like 2, 20, 200?
It's not 2. It's probably not 20. If you're an organization that doesn't have an online presence or doesn't have a website, the number of entity types are going to vary greatly. It wouldn't surprise me if it was close to 100. But when you get that group of that categories, contains customer data, and I have a control that would be associated to that entity type that is how we're going to protect customer data and the privacy controls that would be related to that, that's important, right? So it's all about understanding what are the things that you need to manage, how do you want to manage them, and that's going to drive you to the right number of entity types. Now, I'll just mention one thing here. The system is smart enough. This is where the nesting comes in. I can have the same entity show up in multiple entity types, and I can have that control objective associated to multiple areas, and the system is going to be smart enough to know, okay, it shows up in this one and that one, and so I create this record once, and it will map back to both, but the system is also smart enough to know, well, if it drops out of one and not the other, I need to still maintain that record. It's only if it drops out of all of them would it retire. So don't worry about getting overlap. You're not going to get duplicate records. The system is smart enough to manage that and only remove or retire once something falls out of all groups. And if it already exists, it's not going to create another one. It's going to map.
All right, we're coming close to the hour mark. Before we close, Scott, can you give us your view on the entity class? I've personally heard various approaches to this. Some saying, you need to do it ASAP when you get started. Others saying you don't have to do it at all. Where do you stand?
This is an example of where I've used that same Venn diagram that I was just showing a moment ago. I've created an example of that to demonstrate. The classes are going to become very, very important with our new advanced risk assessment capability. Entity types are all about me getting together a collection of people, places, and things that I need to put into a particular category so I can manage a particular type of risk or a control. The classes, I see them really when we get into things like advanced risk assessment, you do an application risk assessment or an RCSA or one of these other types of assessments, they're going to be driven off of the class. So I'm going to do an organizational assessment, regardless of where that entity may fall in whatever entity type, because the entity type is all about managing a group of items for a particular type of control or risk. The class is going to be used in the assessment to say, well, I need to assess all of my applications across the board, regardless of individual risks or controls that are associated with them. So here in this example that I'm showing you, I've got an entity type called contains financial data. And in my filter, I won't go into the filter, but I'm using some metadata to pull in. There's different ways to accomplish this. But notice the entities that I pulled out here actually span multiple classes. There are servers, but then there are business services, there are applications, there are things, computers. These are classes of entities or those people, places, and things that I want to manage. The classes group them together differently so that I can do things like a application risk assessment, right? That spans across classes versus the entities that are specific areas. I don't know if that helps or not.
This is very helpful.
Just to add something on classes, a very big use case of classes that I've seen is for the aggregation. When you have a hierarchy of entities, to say that if I have a risk or a control related to an entity of a class server, if it's associated to a class application, which is associated to a class business service and then to a department, etc., you can roll up, you can aggregate things together. And it's what you will describe in the GRC Workbench, which is something I promote a lot with my customers as well.
I agree with Eric. And just so for people who haven't seen it, this is when you look at the GRC Workbench to what Eric was just talking about, you set up that model is based upon those classes. So when you do the risk roll-ups, or especially when you get into some of the new risk roll-up dashboards, right? I can have database that supports an application, that supports a business service, that supports a department to a line of business. If I want to understand my ALE, right, my annualized loss expectancy for a line of business across a particular set of risks, it's going to use this class model to create that hierarchy. And then when you actually get into the dependency map, and if I happen to pick, in this case, one of my business services, for example, in the application, I would then see what that model looks like here with my upstream and downstream and what those relationships are. That model gets created by the class, and then the risks that were created through the entity type would then get applied for the roll-ups. And that's, Eric was exactly right there. That's the GRC model is going to help you do that from a risk roll-up perspective.
Anything else? We're good. Many thanks to Eric Martret, Balaji, Rafael, Philip, and of course, Scott. Thank you very much for your time, your advice, your expertise. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us. And it looks like this was useful. And as usual, please continue asking your questions, and maybe we'll keep the conversation going to see if we want to have maybe a regular session like this live to address a particular issue. Have a great evening, a great day. Bye.